So, can you tell us about your background?
I'm a New Zealander. I was born in New Zealand. I'm largely self-taught as an artist. I studied philosophy and architecture for a while, but dropped out relatively early, given I was just too excited by the prospect of getting busy with some of the projects that I had in mind back then. But I think it's worth mentioning that I did grow up in a very rural part of New Zealand, surrounded by synthesizers, fine electronic music, and farm work.
Tell us about your work at Konstmuseet in Skövde.
Well, this is certainly perhaps one of my most ambitious pieces in a few years, one of the more difficult pieces to make. I will say that in advance because it helps to frame, I guess, some of the how I would answer this question. The piece in itself is a number of different things. It's a infrastructural intervention in a sense, in that it engages with economic infrastructure. At the same time, it challenges some of the ideas we have about funding NGOs or non-government organisations, and those that certainly would struggle the most with funding at the moment in the West are, among them are the climate science and climate research organisations. So my idea was to look at this being my very first environmental related work, which is very exciting for me, to look at symptoms of climate change like wind gusts and storms, how I can rather look at them instead of being a negative symptom in the sense of just something we might be terrified of, that planes having to be rerouted, huge storms that result in floods like we saw recently with Houston and the like, but can we look at them as a potential energy, as a source of energy that we can then turn into electricity using wind power to actually generate some kind of a good that can help to mitigate those symptoms, to help to work better to understand how they occur. And so what I did is I took the wind energy, which of course electricity is the output, and used that to mine a form of digital currency called cryptocurrency that most people would have heard of in relation to, say, Bitcoin. Cryptocurrency is itself very abstract, so I'll talk about that in a little bit, but let's just say that is already possible and has been done now for some years. You can mine currency computationally, and that's the work that's done, rather than digging holes in the ground or serving cups of coffee or putting fence posts in. The work is done entirely computationally, and the value is earned that way. And so as a function of wind energy from wind gusts and storms, computational power is enabled that can then generate capital that can then be injected directly into climate change research. It's a kind of an autopoiesis where a snake, if you like, eats its own tail. It's a poetic feedback loop in that it repotentializes what is otherwise anticipated as or understood as a negative, and brings it into the domain of something positive as a value. Cryptocurrencies themselves are certainly hard to understand. I won't talk about that too much, but let's just say that that even with our existing traditional financial system, there is an ever-present need for bookkeeping, for verifying transactions, and our entire financial system is built upon that. Stock markets trade based on verified transactions, not on unverified ones, unless of course they're strictly speculative, I suppose. But anyway, the mining process, when we talk about mining cryptocurrency, is really a bookkeeping task. So computers all over the world, interconnected, all serve the role of verifying transactions, actual transactions, and that comprise this thing called the blockchain. And by verifying and authenticating them, there can be this economic system, or this economic layer that isn't cash, that isn't just online banking as a whole, or strictly digital currency. It's a whole new form of currency, and obviously there are a great many people that make a lot of money that way. But rather than the wind energy being used to power the computational process, the mining process, something which is extraordinarily expensive and prohibitively expensive to do in your home. I mean, your power bill will go up 4 or 5 times. I'm taking sort of free energy, if you like, and using that to mine, and rather than filling up my own pocket, it goes straight into a selected climate change research organisations. Yeah.
So, what do you tell us about your creative process?
Well, that's certainly a tricky one. I refer to myself first and foremost as a critical engineer, and I would need to explain that a critical engineer was a term that was coined by my studio partners and myself in a 2011 manifesto, the Critical Engineering Manifesto. We all saw a need to separate ourselves a little bit from strictly media art, or Medienkunst auf Deutsch, and reframe engineering as being a foreground material. It's ideologies, it's many disciplines within the creative and critical process. We firmly believe that, as we wrote in that manifesto, one was quickly translated into 15 languages and is taught in universities all over the world now, in many books too. It's essential that we don't ignore engineering when we're talking about critically and also creatively engaging the world that we live in. So much of our experience is engineered. Our cities are literally life support systems holding them up. If water doesn't come out of the tap, we tend to panic. The cell phone network goes down, and we almost don't know how to persist. We are shaped by the tools that we use, and in doing so, we become dependent upon them, deeply dependent. And culturally, socially, we also see direct expressions of new technologies and these dependencies. And so, for me, I'm very interested in getting right down on that infrastructural, technical layer, and finding these points of vulnerability and finding ways to hack. I use hacking methodologies and tactics and actual tools in my work, and have done so for many years. I'm interested in interventions on infrastructure. I'm interested in also perverting, if you like, or repurposing, reappropriating, hacking existing technologies and using them for alternative ends, such that we can have that kind of critical break in relation to that technology and think differently about it, and then maybe reposition ourselves techno-politically, culturally, socially, techno-culturally, techno-socially in relation to it. So when I see an opportunity to take 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 otherwise disparate things, including cultural ideas or belief systems, ontologies, but also technical works, infrastructures, and build something productively monstrous, if you like, out of them, connecting one to the next, feeding back, etc., as required, I become, that's my moment of inspiration. I'm not looking for a way to continue or complete pre-existing narratives within art historical contexts. I'm strictly interested in that critical break. Yeah.
So you basically answered my last question. What's your inspiration?
Oh yes, this typically happens in interview situations. Yes, well, again, what happens in yeah, I will sometimes actually, to be honest, have also a hunch that there is something there, and I will need to dig deeper. But for me, I'm not actually working. I'm not making good new work unless I'm challenged. With this particular project, I was really challenged. I mean, I was working outside of a strictly software or formally engineering in some senses too. I was working in a sort of almost a land art kind of a context in some respects, but most importantly within this highly contingent universe of weather, and that I found very inspiring. Even before knowing what I was getting into, the idea that I might not know what I'm facing and what challenges I will face that is itself a hook, an inspiration that is very hard for me to let go of. And I've learned everything about humidity in outdoor environments from day to night, insects and the kinds of insects that crawl up from the ground and can enter your outdoor installation or the component of it. I've learned a lot about electricity, but directly generated from wind, and yeah, these have been huge pulls for me to move into the unknown and to learn how this can be done. Yeah, that is, speaking honestly, a huge source of inspiration.